All right, here we go. We have DC Mayor Muriel Bowser in the building.
Yes. Hey, Vlad. How are you?
I'm great. Welcome to Vlad TV for the first time.
I know. I'm sorry it took a pandemic to get me on Vlad TV. I've been trying and trying and trying.
Well, we finally got here, and I'm glad we are.
Yes.
All right. Well, this is your first time here, so I really want to get into your whole story because I think you have a very exceptional story that a lot of people will be inspired by. So, you actually grew up in, I guess, North Michigan Park, which is Northeast DC?
I did. Very much so. And my parents still live there.
Okay. And you're the youngest of 6 children.
Of 5.
Oh, youngest of 5.
Yeah.
Okay. What were your parents doing for a living?
My parents worked in the government. My dad worked for the public schools here in DC as a facilities manager. My mother is a nurse, and she worked for many hospitals, including the Veterans Hospital and the Psychiatric Hospital here.
Okay. But having that many children, did your parents struggle or were you guys okay, middle class?
No, we had a great upbringing, and they made a lot of sacrifices for us. They're just good, hardworking people who put faith and family and hard work at the top of their list. They raised us in one of the best of neighborhoods, in my opinion, in Washington, D.C., where all the neighbors knew each other, looked out for each other, kids played together, grew up together, and it's just a great D.C. story.
Well, you grew up with 2 working parents in a middle class neighborhood, but during the 80s, the rest of DC was actually going through a really bad transformation with crack hitting.
Yeah.
And you're old enough to remember the early 80s when things started to actually change. Dave Chappelle, who, talked about you in one of his recent specials, he mentions that all the time.
Yeah.
How much were you seeing DC change during that era?
Well, I think Dave and I are probably in the same age group. I think he's a little bit older than me. And it was really the 90s that it was really bad in DC with the crack epidemic and the violence epidemic that went along with it. And you see from that era, the kind of the mass incarceration issues that happened that really destroyed neighborhoods. So young people went away for years. Other families were destroyed by crack. Grandparents became primary caregivers for children. Children were basically disabled in school from the effects of crack. So it was a very, very tough time in DC. And it was a tough time economically outside of that for the district. So the government programs and such weren't helping spin us out of that. So a lot has changed, certainly in the city. During that time, we were probably 76% African American. Now we're about 48% African American. So we've had a lot of transformation in the city. The city has become pretty affluent. We've grown. In the 90s, we probably had 550,000 people. Now we have over 700,000 people. So there's been some good and bad with that change. As you can imagine, the impact on the culture has been pretty devastating in some ways. In other ways, our government can now invest in schools and healthcare and parks and recreation. So the balance for somebody like me who grew up in DC and has lived through the bad and now gets to experience the good, it's a struggle to make sure more Washingtonians can experience the good.
Well, you went to Elizabeth Seton High School, I guess?
Did.
And which was a private all-girls Catholic school.
Correct.
You went there and then you got your bachelor's degree in history from Chatham University.
Yes.
Then a master's in public policy from American University.
Correct.
But you said you never really envisioned yourself as a politician or a mayor. At what point during all that schooling did you say, okay, I want to get into politics?
I don't think I ever had that thought while I was going to school. I just knew at some point when I was in graduate school that I loved local government. I fell in love with it. I got an internship, and I knew that that was how I would help the most people and do it the fastest. So I thought I would be in local government, maybe run a government agency. And quickly, I realized that it is the elected official who can make things happen the fastest.
Okay, so I guess your first elected position was the Advisory Neighborhood Commission in 2004?
Yes. That's a
Okay.
volunteer position in DC. It's like being a glutton for punishment, kind of. So you represent 2,000 people. Most people have full-time jobs, and you are there to make sure the government does what they want. And that's what I did.
Okay, so then after that in 2007, you were elected to the Council of District of Columbia in a special election.
Yes.
So that was more of a kind of a mainstream kind of a position?
Yeah, so in DC, you know that we're unique, right? Not a city, not a county, not a state, and definitely not a territory. And we're unique also in the world in that we're the capital city of the United States of America, and we do not have voting representation in Congress. So we have a congresswoman, she doesn't vote. We don't have two senators at all. So anything that happens in the Senate, we could be left out of. Like we were left out of this CARES Act that the Congress just passed. And instead of giving us state funding like we get for everything, they called us a territory. In territories, they're great, they're fine, they're Americans, but they don't pay taxes like we do. So we pay taxes just like every Californian, New Yorker, Texan, you name it. We pay taxes just like every state. In fact, we pay more taxes than 22 states, and we pay more per capita than any state. So that is kind of the DC situation. So in our city, we have state functions, county functions, and city functions. So in a way, I'm the mayor, county executive, and the governor for 700,000 people. And we're also kind of unique in that our legislative body has only 13 people. So the 14 of us, our council of DC and me, we make the budgets, all legislative decisions, and execute the law. In some ways, that's really good because we can be nimble. We can come up with an idea, fund it, and implement it in a pretty short time. So the council, the role that you just mentioned, I was a ward council member. We have 13 council members, and I was one of them for almost 8 years.
Okay, and then in 2014, you decided to run for mayor.
I did.
What made you take on a job like that?
Being mayor of your hometown is the best job you can ever imagine, especially in Washington, D.C. And I knew that we were going to have an election where a lot of people would run. And I said, I have great ideas. I have a great work ethic. I know this city. I know the past. I can see its future. I'm going to run. I can be mayor. And I was very fortunate. I was elected and then elected 4 years later. And now I'm serving in my second term as mayor of DC.
How did it feel to win that election?
It felt incredible. I felt very lucky. It's a humbling experience for sure, because at any position, I think you'll hear this from a lot of elected officials. People are literally trusting you with their life, and they're taking a bet on you in a lot of ways. They're taking a bet, most of all, that you're going to be honest, you're going to serve with integrity, and you are going to have more information about a lot of topics than they do. And you're going to use that information to make the best decisions for them and for the most people. And so it's really a position of trust.
Well, Netflix just put out a Dave Chappelle special where he was accepting the Mark Twain Award
Yes.
for comedy. And in that special, he was doing stand-up. I guess it was in a DC comedy club?
It was at the Improv, yes.
At the Improv. And you were in the audience.
I was.
And he said, shout out to Muriel Bowser. We're only a year apart, and you run our city wonderfully.
Thank you.
You're a blessing to the city.
Yes.
I've never voted in Washington, but if I ever did, I'd vote for you.
Yes, I
And
love.
then he said, if you smoked crack, I'd still vote for you.
Well,
I know you wouldn't, but if you want to indulge yourself, you have that kind of wiggle room with me.
well, you know Dave, and we are so proud of Dave. Dave went to Duke Ellington School of the Performing Arts, and he has never forgotten us. It kind of reminds me, I heard the mayor of Minneapolis one time say after Prince's death, she said about him that he was a megastar, a superstar, but he never left us and he never forgot us in Minneapolis. And that's how Dave is with Washington, D.C. And what you don't see, and probably what you didn't see in that special, is what the time that he spent with kids, aspiring artists like himself, and really pouring into them, challenging them, and never forgetting them. Dave, I think, has won 2 Emmys or Grammys, or maybe both, and brought them where they sit at Duke Ellington, so the kids can see that a kid from DC who has a dream, and in Dave's case, a mom who would drive him to comedy clubs so he could perfect his art, and teachers who believed in them at Duke Ellington. They can make it, and they can make it big.
Yeah, I actually looked it up. He has a Grammy for Best Comedy Album.
Okay.
And he also has a Primetime Emmy for the Chappelle Show.
Yep.
So you were right. Well, the comment he made about the smoking crack, he's referring to Marion Barry.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Marion Barry actually supported your election.
He did.
Now, DC always has a very interesting history when it comes to Marion Barry. Marion Barry, after being elected mayor, he was caught on camera during an FBI sting operation smoking crack with a woman in a hotel room. He ended up serving 6 months in prison, and that just became kind of a black eye for DC. Chris Rock, during his comedy special, did the whole smoke crack and got your job back. Living in DC, how did you feel about that whole the whole Marion Barry thing when he got arrested?
Well, Marion Barry is one of a kind, and I think history will show that the good that he has done for DC and for Black people in particular, for growing a middle class and putting and making our city a contender. I mean, Marion Barry, in good ways and bad ways, put DC on the map, and so people knew that we were a contender. But he was a man. He wasn't perfect. He had frailties, and the damage that he did largely was to himself. And he paid the price. Personally, professionally, he paid the price. But he came back. And it's kind of a DC story in a lot of ways. I tell people all the time that we have the spirit in this town of falling down and getting back up, of dusting yourself off and trying again, of being a city of second chances. And so that's personified in Mayor Barry. So you can go all over this city in over all 8 wards, young people, old people, white people, Black people, straight people, gay people. I promise you, they have a Marion Barry story of how he impacted their life. So we erected a statue for Marion a couple years ago, just following his death. And I was very pleased to see a lot of things that were written and said about him reflected the totality of his life. And I had the opportunity to know him. So I'm proud of that.
What was your relationship like with Marion Barry?
It was interesting because my father is a DC politico, and Marion knew him. And I come from an era where, as a kid, I grew up in politics, so I knew him from a kid. And then I got to be his counterpart on the council. So we're actually sitting on the dais together. So Marion saw me as a person that could lead the city and not make the mistakes that he made. So he spent a lot of time at the end of his life making sure I knew what he knew.
What do you think is your craziest story about Marion Barry?
Oh, man. I probably have a lot of crazy Marion Barry stories from, one time he was talking about I don't even know what the issue was, but we were on the dais and everybody was focused on him. And he turned and he looked at me and he said, Miss Bowser, you shouldn't be voting on this, Miss Bowser. Another time we were going to an event and he just drove up to the event. It was a backyard party. He got out of his car. He left it in the middle of the street. Door open and just walked in. But that was him. Other times I would be campaigning and I wanted to knock on doors and I said, Marion, I can't talk to you right now, Mr. Barry. I'm campaigning. And he said, you need to be talking to me. So, he was one of a kind. That's all I can say.
Well, rest in peace, Marion Barry.
Peace.
I got to meet him briefly once when I was in D.C. He was, you're right, one of a kind.
One of a kind.
When I talk to people from D.C. and I ask how he got reelected, the story I would always hear is, you just don't understand as an outsider how much love he had for the people. And that's what ended up carrying him through that second election.
Right. But let's face it. We should be people that people can earn a second chance. And if you earn a second chance, people will give you one. And we are a city like that. We're a city of second chances. When are you coming back?
Soon.
All right.
We got soon as I can fly again.
Yes.
Well, during your first year as mayor, the district saw a 40% increase in homicides. What happened during that time and how did you address it?
Well, the thing about crime is you don't always know why it goes up and you don't always know why it goes down. And so what we did is we literally threw everything at the problem that we could, from job training programs to extending the summer youth program to expanding our police cadet program. To also working on the enforcement side to make sure that our laws were really dealing with people who just wouldn't follow the law and who are using guns and who had demonstrated that they would use guns. So we attacked it from what I call the opportunity side, giving people opportunities so they won't commit crime, to the enforcement side. And we saw those numbers go down the following year. We've had some go back up, but we still remain very concerned about crime. There are too many illegal guns in our city, and there are too many people who are hopeless and who are willing to use them.
Well, during that time, you proposed legislation that would allow warrantless searches of violent ex-offenders.
Yep.
And that bill had a lot of pushback and ultimately didn't pass. And there's always a lot of talk about bills like this. There's like stop and frisk and so forth. Would you compare it to that? And how do you feel about it today?
It is not something that people of the District of Columbia support or the law enforcement people who would have to enact it would support. And all I care about, Vlad, is how to get illegal guns. And I am willing to look at any strategy that is constitutional, that allows us to get at illegal guns. And we have tried all kinds of ways to get at them, including offering rewards to people who have them, to making the law clear about straw purchases. For example, if you are not supposed to have a gun, you can't ask your girlfriend to go to Virginia and buy a gun. Okay, so we have to make clear all of those laws and make sure people are following them. This is one thing I know for sure about homicides in our city. We could take down petty squabbles that people are fixing with guns. If they didn't have a gun, we may have a fight, we may have an altercation, we may even have an assault, but what we wouldn't have is a homicide. So dealing with that is hugely important. I just got a text from my chief that we had a domestic violence homicide here yesterday. A man, killed his ex-girlfriend. So we have people who are living in their homes and living in their communities who are scared because of illegal guns.
Well, I know you have to go soon. So my final question is, here we are in the middle of the coronavirus epidemic. And we have a situation, from what I understand, that DC did not get the money that it was supposed to get. And from what I'm hearing, it was because you actually supported Bloomberg during his run. And this is somewhat of a retaliation, Would that be fair from Trump?
I've never heard that.
Okay.
I've never
That's what I
heard
heard.
that. And actually, it's in the hands of the Congress, not Trump. So we need the Democrats and Republicans in the Senate and in the House to make sure that DC is treated like it's always treated for federal funding, for education, for housing, you name it. We're treated as the state for federal funding. And so whatever comes out of the Congress, that needs to be fixed. Now, President Trump can do something in the meantime. He can talk to his Treasury Secretary to make sure that the money that's missing, over $700 million that's missing, comes to DC from the Treasury. But the Congress still needs to fix this reference to DC as a territory.
You're overseeing the worst catastrophe in the last 100 years.
Yep.
How bad has it gotten for you personally to try to deal with so many people that are getting sick, people dying? You know, you just announced that there's the first death in one of the jails in D.C. Unbelievable numbers of people are unemployed. Businesses are going out of business. The $1,200 stimulus check is not enough for people to just get by. How bad have things really gotten in D.C. from your point of view?
Well, it's just sad. It's incredibly sad. So I think you started off talking about this initially. Like, we went into this pandemic with a bustling economy. I mean, booming. Restaurants opening, businesses opening, people employed, great theater, great arts, great sports and entertainment, and a pretty low unemployment rate compared to 5 years ago when I became mayor. And all of that stopped in an instant. It's like inducing a coma to save yourself. And that's what stay-at-home orders do. Closing down businesses do. It puts your economy in a coma and gives your medical apparatus a chance to deal with people who will get sick. And that's what we've been doing and trying to contain the spread of this virus. So I think initially I was just really sad for everybody who lost their jobs, who had great businesses that they had to close. Those were the first impacts. And then we saw people starting to get infected and sick, and the anxiety that all of that has created among African Americans who are disproportionately affected by this disease, especially in DC, and the medical communities or who are concerned about workers and PPE. So all of that. So the bottom line to your question is our budget has been dinged by $600 million this year. We have over 60,000 people applying for unemployment. That is way more than applied for unemployment in all of last year, just in the last 6 weeks. And we don't know how many of those businesses are going to be able to make it back. So that is when we start talking about how we bring the economy back, we have all of those things in mind, while at the same time trying to manage this virus that doesn't have any treatment or a vaccine and limited testing available. So there's a lot for us to consider in getting our economy back. But the bottom line, I want people to go back to work. I want kids to go back to school, number one on my list. But we have to do it in a way that's safe.
I mean, certain mayors are starting to talk about a program to open businesses back up, open schools back up, and so forth. Do you have something like that in mind that you've announced yet or are planning, or not so much?
We are in the planning stages of figuring out how we can slowly turn the spigot on. And I think that's how we should think about it. We won't be able to flip a switch and go back to normal, but we have to slowly be able to add activities in our economy while being able to monitor the health of our residents.
I feel you. Well, you have a very tough job ahead.
Thank you, Vlad.
And it seems like you're doing a great job.
All right. It's been great chatting with you. We'll see you soon.
Absolutely.
All right.
Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Peace.